I will build a great, great wall, and I will have Mexico pay for that wall. Mark my words. You hear it's like they're better people than what we have, than our citizens. It's not true. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. I just think it's changing the culture. I think it's a very negative thing. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall.
There are many reasons why at different points in American history or in general, people are uncomfortable with new immigrants.
People who are concerned about America, if you push on it, what they're concerned about is America becoming a little too diverse.
Different languages, different cultures, different religions, different racial backgrounds. They're not going to assimilate. I think those kinds of fears are common.
Immigration has always been kind of like a lightning rod, right? It's always been an issue that got people riled up at political rallies. But until recently, it was not the number one issue that people voted on. It gets a lot of campaign rallies hyped up, but people don't vote on immigration until recently, until now.
There are a number of ways in which immigration today is different than it was in the past.
There's always been control over migrants, but it was a local or state affair until after the Civil War.
The first immigration law was the Paige Act, which is in 1875. It prohibited the entry of, quote, undesirables, and it was really targeted at Asians.
The first group that came under restriction were the Chinese, who were excluded categorically.
The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first to exclude any group on the basis of race, and banned the entry of virtually any Chinese.
There were what we call qualitative restrictions. So individuals would be barred if they came with a contagious disease, or if they were thought to have a criminal background, or if they had no money on them and no visible means of support, right? Or if they limped at Ellis Island, their able-bodiedness and their ability to work would be a question, right? But at Ellis Island, they only turned away 2% of the people who showed up during its peak years, 2%. So 25 million people came from 1890 to World War I, 25 million, and 2% were turned away.
The 1924 restrictions was the first to limit the numbers of immigrants who could come in, and it also set up national origins quotas. Each different nation had a different quota.
Before the war, you had 1 million people coming a year, and they cut it to 150,000 a year. That's a tremendous drop.
The next significant act, I would say the most significant act, was 65.
The Heart Cellar Act, which eliminated the national origin quotas, but still kept a very low ceiling. We still have very low numerical quotas on immigration.
And also, it meant that people got visas or on the basis of family reunification and employment.
They're going to take our jobs.
Yes.
They won't assimilate.
Mm-hmm.
They won't learn the language.
Yes.
Except we seem to be making that same argument
Once again,
every time
we
this
do.
happens.
We make those arguments every time, and research shows that those are not true, that they're myths.
The historical pattern is this. The first generation, the immigrant generation, usually does not learn much English, does not assimilate well. They are usually stuck in certain lower level jobs, and they live in immigrant communities.
If they come as adults, they often speak their home country language, they learn English, but often not that well.
What people complain about today, that was the same as their ancestors. If you went to the Lower East Side in New York in 1900, you didn't hear anybody speaking English. And you saw very few people who ever left that neighborhood.
Their children speak English, but often may speak the home country language, so they may be bilingual.
It's the second generation, it's the children who go to school here. They learn English. They become assimilated into American culture.
By the third generation, overwhelmingly monolingual English. This happens today, and it happened in the past.
Meaning they don't speak their ancestors' language anymore, and they start to marry outside of their group. And you can see the same trend today. So the patterns are remarkably similar.
All Americans are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by citizens or legal immigrants.
We bring over 1 million immigrants into this country a year. For some people, they may think that that's a symbol of America's virtue and generosity. I think it's a symbol that we're not committed to working class Americans.
So with immigration, you better be smart and you better be tough, and they're taking your jobs and you better be careful.
I think politicians have always found anti-immigration politics to be a kind of cheap politics. Those guys took your jobs. Well, actually, they didn't take your jobs. You know, your factory closed and moved somewhere else out of the country. Immigrants aren't working in the auto factories in Detroit, right? This idea that they took your jobs, you know, touches something. It's like a button that gets pushed. And I say it's cheap because it lets the politicians off the hook for fixing the real problem.
A lot of these fears about immigrants are not real. I mean, they're not backed up by reality. There's a lot of economic literature today which shows that immigrants do not take jobs away from the native born. I mean, if there's any competition at all, it's a little tiny bit, and it's with men with less than a high school degree. But otherwise, immigrants actually create jobs. They form businesses.
Immigrants have a much lower rate of using public benefits than non-immigrants. Immigrants come here to work. They don't come here to be on welfare.
Crime. The rates of crime among immigrants are lower than they are for the native born. This was true 100 years ago, and it's true today. Immigrants come and they work hard. They don't want to be jailed. Before they're citizens, they could be sent back to their home country. They have a motivation to work hard and not get into trouble. And in fact, research today not only shows that immigrants commit fewer crimes and are incarcerated at lower rates than the native born, but when they move into neighborhoods, they tend to make the neighborhoods safer.
But then there's always been people who oppose immigration because they want the country to be more homogenous, which is another way of saying they want it to be more white. And what white means at different times is different. So in the early 20th century, white really meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
People who are looking back to their immigrant roots are looking back to different countries in Europe, where their ancestors came from, often with great pride, but they look to the past with rose-colored glasses. They romanticize the past.
People remember differently when they say, my parents, they came here and the first thing they did is they learned English. Well, that's not true, probably.
They came, they assimilated right away. Well, that didn't happen.
They became American citizens. Well, actually, naturalization rates were really, really low in the early 20th century.
They were the good immigrants, and they were legal. Now, of course, they were mostly legal, and one reason is because there were no numerical limitations on immigration.
You only have illegal immigration or unlawful entry when there are barriers to entry. We had an open door. The Chinese were kept out, and Europeans who were suspected of not being able-bodied workers were kept out. But to say, my ancestors came legally, when everybody came legally, is not a great distinction. It's not a great honor, right?
The question is, what happens with those fears? Do they dissipate as people become used to immigrants, as immigrants become more Americanized, and certainly as their children become Americans and assimilate, or they become a basis for anti-immigrant and nativist movements? At certain periods in American history, they have.
German Americans were a very robust, culturally distinct ethnic group in the 19th century. And they had German language newspapers, German language schools. It's a very rich culture. And during World War I, they came under tremendous attack because the government needed to create a demon out of the Hun, right, quote unquote, the Hun. They really demonized German Americans, and they closed their schools, they closed their newspapers. And German Americans basically had to make a decision, or they made a decision, to forsake their ethnic heritage in order to not be attacked.
Prior to the 60s in this country, the immigrants who came were overwhelmingly from Europe. Today, most immigrants who come to the US are from Latin America or Asia. There are also some from Africa and the Caribbean. So there is that racial element too, certainly with the Chinese, certainly with Jews and Italians, and we see it today with Mexicans in particular because they're the largest group in the US, but particularly with Latin Americans and with Black immigrants. And so I think, there is a racial undertone to this.
I think it's a fear of difference, and I think it's the influence of racism, the influence of the idea that this nation should be a certain way and not a different way. They also like to make up stories about their own success. I climbed up the ladder without any help from anybody else. And now look at the immigrants, they're all getting, they're all welfare cheats.
I think another difference between immigration today and in the past is that where they're going in the US. 100 years ago, most immigrants went to the Northeast and to the Midwest. That's where they mostly lived. Today, immigrants are everywhere.
They're in all major areas of the country, all major cities, and people come into contact with immigrants all the time. They work in their restaurants, they work in hotels, they work in construction, they do people's gardening, take care of their children. So immigrants are far more dispersed throughout the country. They're still concentrated in certain cities and certain states, but they really do live everywhere.
The South it's amazing. North Carolina, Georgia, states that really never had much immigration have a lot of immigrants now.
So now many more people know immigrants and they see the contributions they make to their communities.
Build the wall! Build the wall!
Even though we have a very loud nativist constituency in this country, it's not a majority of opinion. All the polling data show that 2/3 or more of the American people think immigration is a good thing for the country. They think people who are here without documents should be legalized and have a chance to apply for citizenship. They think immigration should be kept the same or increased. This is where the strong majority sentiments lie. It's a minority, it's 1/3 or less of American people who have a strong nativist opinion that immigrants should be kicked out and that illegal immigrants should all be kicked out.
We cannot build a unified country by inciting people to anger or playing on anyone's fears or exploiting the issue of immigration for political gain.
Let's address ourselves to the fundamentals. These are good people, strong people. Part of my family is a Mexican.
We must always remember that real lives will be affected by our debates and decisions, and that every human being has dignity and value, no matter what their citizenship papers say.
Rather than making them or talking about putting up a fence, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems and make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit, and then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here. And when they want to go back, they can go back and they can cross and open the border both ways.
Whether our forebears were strangers who crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Rio Grande, we are here only because this country welcomed them in and taught them that to be an American is about something more than what we look like or what our last names are or how we worship.